Welcome to the If You Could See Me podcast. I'm your host, Erin Mahone. I'm an author, storyteller, facilitator, and mental health professional. I believe that mental health is health, and it goes so far beyond conversations about illness, medications, and treatment. When I set out to create this thing, I had no idea what I was doing. Just that I wanted to share my story, and I hoped I wasn't alone. I've discovered that so many people need to find solidarity. They need to know they aren't alone. Well, I'm here to tell you, you are not alone. Enjoy the show. Hello, friends and family, and welcome to the newest, most recent episode in season 3 of the If You Could See Me podcast. I am your host, Erin Mahone. I am really excited today to get to meet a brand new friend. I am going to be talking to musician Alden Groves. Alden, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy music schedule to talk to us.
Hey, I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
I'm excited too. I really like your music, first of all.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. So I'm glad that's connecting at least.
Yeah, totally. What it's true. You know, it helps to have your be interviewed by somebody who appreciates your stuff, no doubt.
I do appreciate it.
Talk to me a little bit about who was Alden Groves as like a 7-year-old kid?
Oh gosh, that's an interesting question. Admittedly, I have pretty hazy memories of my early life. I would say anything before about the age of 10 starts to get really fuzzy. I'm unclear as to why that is, but I had some substance abuse issues in my teenage years that I expect contributed to that a little bit.
Sure.
But what I do have is some stories from my family, mostly my dad. Apparently, I was just like I was very sensitive. I used to say, "You hurt my feelers" when someone, I know, like just cartoonishly adorable, according to my family. But I imagine that's what families say about kids in the family. But yeah, I was apparently always pretty docile and sensitive and touchy-feely, and you know.
You are truly like one of my people.
Yes.
Except that, I mean, other than the "you hurt my feelers," which is just absolutely precious. I love that so much. You know, I was a really sensitive kid too, and people just got really annoyed with me. So for being so sensitive. So it's nice that you were sort of allowed to be, a sensitive kid, especially, being a boy.
Yeah, well, and that's actually what I was going to say, is hearing you say that reminded me that I definitely got told not to cry on the playground a couple times by people. It was definitely sort of shunned out of me by my peers in elementary school, but the family was accepting of it at least.
That's so great. So how did you come to music?
There's a couple answers to that. The first is that my family gave me piano lessons basically as early as I can remember. I really did not like them. I hated them. Practice, and I did not do a good job. I was in choir in elementary school, which I don't have any memories of feeling strongly about one way or the other. And then when music actually became something that I wanted to do was probably when I was about 10 or 11. And I got really into the game Guitar Hero. And I just got way too into it. And my dad was eventually, he said, if you're going to play this game that much, you may as well get a real guitar and learn guitar instead of, learning to play this plastic guitar that just is only functional for the purposes of this game, which is a good point, frankly.
Smart dad. Great.
Exactly. And so I said, all right, well, you buy me a guitar and I'll do it. And, I had to wash the car and do a bunch of chores and stuff for X number of weeks to be able to earn the guitar, but I did, and then started going to lessons, and that's really what got me started. I remember as early as being probably 11 or 12 and saying that I wanted to be a professional musician, and my more business savvy friends being like, that's a ridiculous thing to want to be. College.
Wow.
Very
Your friends said that to you?
Yeah. Well, there's one guy, I think, as I understand it, it is just sort of how his family is very savvy, business acumen kind of thing. And for me to say I wanted to be a musician, he was like, but you're so smart. You should be doing something with your mind, which is very much a business perspective on the arts.
But music also requires you to use your mind in very specific and particular ways.
Exactly.
So did your family accept you as a musician, as a creative person?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, my mom's an artist, so it's, she was like, welcome to the team, bud. My dad and I kind of went back and forth on it a little bit. I think that where we landed is a place of acceptance and understanding, but I think he just wanted the best for me, and statistically speaking, that's a college degree is what's going to make you more money and provide more stability. So I think that his concern was mostly with just helping me to get there, and once it kind of became obvious that that was a road that I was not going to travel, we kind of came to a better understanding, and now I'm doing great. So it's it's all's well that ends well.
Right.
So
right.
far.
As long as you can support yourself, that's really all that parents care about.
Yeah, basically being stable and supported and happy and healthy to the best of one's ability.
Sure. So can you tell me a little bit about, when you started to have issues or challenges with your own mental health?
So, like I said, I was a sensitive kid, and
Mm-hmm.
you can look at that from a couple different perspectives. As for whether that's the beginning of a mental health thing, it's not for me to say. I will say I remember struggling with depression really badly right around end of middle school, beginning of high school.
Mm-hmm.
Like age 13 or 14. My best friend moved out of state, and I went to this new school where I didn't know anybody, and I was just this very sort of awkward dude, and I had really bad social anxiety. I was sort of like outcast kid all through middle school. And when I went to high school, it was all of that compounded with not knowing anybody. And so I started struggling really bad with depression. I had anxiety so bad that I almost couldn't speak to people. And when I did, I sort of had this habit of being a compulsive liar. I would just say things that I imagined would be interesting to people because I felt as though my life was not substantially interesting. So I think that right around age 14 was when it really started to kind of dovetail a little bit. And also, that was right when I had my first drink. Like I started drinking and smoking weed when I was 14 or so at this school. And so those two things tend to go hand in hand and exacerbate each other, mental health and substance abuse. And that was the beginning of my personal spiral there.
So when did music become a thing that helped you express your experiences with mental health? You have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder.
Correct.
And I really love your titles, Crazy and Anhedonia. I think that's really, it's just a really accessible way for somebody who lives in this world to go, oh, this guy gets it. He gets me. He's speaking my language. Not many people know what Anhedonia is.
Right. So that one, the title for that, actually, my therapist, I was explaining to her, how I was feeling. This was maybe a year ago, if even. And I was saying, I am not excited by anything, and I don't want to do this, and I'm feeling unhappy with this, and I just don't want to do anything. She was like, oh, that sounds like Anhedonia. And I was like, that's a beautiful word. Will you say it again? And I wrote it down, and then the song, came together a few days later. But to answer your question, as far as how music initially became part of my, I guess, coping toolkit, I think that it was something that I used to deal with stuff. I think I was more using it as a distraction initially. Like
Sure.
I would, they would give us work time in math class to work on our projects, and I would pop open my laptop and start making a beat, or they would, I would be at home and I was always working on music. I think at that point it was a form of escapism.
Right.
It really became a way for me to express what I was going through and process it until after I got clean and sober when I was 18. And I think that was when I started singing again. I started working lyricism back into my music. I started actually using it as a tool to directly relate to my experiences rather than just making beats and, making dance music, which is what I did for a very long time.
And so I'm curious to know what is the connection between your, healthier self and your interest or ability to sing as opposed to not singing. It seems, that seems symbolic in some way.
I absolutely agree that there is a symbology to it. I think that it was, like I said, it was initially a form of escapism, and this isn't a knock against electronic music, but for me, it was sort of a cold and calculated way of just sort of hacking emotions, like make this very big buildup and that'll make you happy, and make all these very loud and abrasive and aggressive sounds that were technically interesting. It was like an engineering feat, and particularly the kind of music that I was working in was like it was more like a well-engineered clock than it was a painting. And I think for me, the big difference when I went to treatment and got sober and was able to start addressing these mental health things, although my understanding of it as a mental health issue didn't come until quite a bit later, I think that it just enabled me to actually even look at my life. I prior to that was really unwilling to look at myself or my life or any of my actions or the consequences of them. And really, in order to have a successful recovery from substance abuse, you have to examine and change and confront your life and yourself. And once I started doing that, I found that there was a lot of emotion there that needed to be processed and that I wanted to communicate. And I guess in learning that, I started to hone my ability to more effectively communicate them.
I've been in that place in my own, mental health, experience, journey, whatever you want to call it, where I just had nothing to say, but still felt compelled to be doing something, but had nothing to say. And that is a dark place.
Mm-hmm.
It is. And I'm curious, when you were in that electronic phase, did you want to have more to say, or, were you really just escaping?
I think that I was trying my hardest with the tools that I was comfortable using to express myself.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true at the level of just my emotion. Like I used to be a very sort of rationally minded person. Like I felt like one of the reasons I had social anxiety so bad was that I felt as though I needed to think about what I said before I said it. I shouldn't say anything that I don't think is a smart thing to say. And of course, with any social acumen knows that's a great way to not say anything at all. And then when you do something to say, you're several minutes behind in the conversation and it's no longer relevant. And so you end up saying nothing, which feels weird. And then other people feel weird that you're there. And it's, it's one of those self-compounding issues. But when it came to music, my toolkit was rationality and music theory and the beat making programs that I used and tutorials on YouTube. And so I really do think I was trying to express myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that was the best I could do at the time. And I think that as my toolkit expanded in terms of, literally getting a microphone and literally starting to sing and literally being able to route my guitar into my software, as well as having an understanding of my emotions and understanding, okay, how am I feeling right now? Not just what do I think about this. I remember one of my first experiences with a therapist. He asked me, and he had this very cheesy feeling wheel thing that he was using that I still think looks very silly, and I sort of shudder at the thought of trying to use that to communicate to somebody else. But he sort of asked me, how do you feel about this situation? And I said something to the tune of like, I feel like they are not thinking about how this is going to affect me. And, it was explained to me at that point that that's not a feeling, that's a thought. A feeling is experienced. It's in your body, it's in your chest, and it's, behind your head. It's not a complex series of if-then statements. And I think that once that really was internalized for me, once I was able to differentiate between my experience of things and my thoughts about those things, I found meditation, for example, and that really that dichotomy more than almost anything else.
Yeah.
Once I got there, it was I could communicate both rather than just one.
What was the moment that made you decide to get clean and go into therapy and, do all of that? Was it a moment, or was it a gradual series of events?
I had no reason to believe that rehab was an option for me. And I'd been trying to get clean for several years through NA, which is Narcotics Anonymous, really similar to the AA program that I imagine a lot of people are familiar with.
Yep.
And I was never able to get more than like a day or two sober because I was addicted to opiates. Those are some of the more difficult withdrawals to cope with. They're not, potentially fatal per se, but they're certainly not pleasant. And I just had sort of been trying on my own and failing and trying on my own and failing. And as soon as my dad was sure that this was that was happening, he said, I can tell that you're high, and I can tell that you've been getting high. Like, it's clear to me that you have a problem. And that was all he even said. And I broke down and was just like, I want to go to rehab. Please, please help me get clean.
Right.
And it's such a blessing that he was understanding enough and had the resources to be able to help me with that. He sent me to a rehab center in Loveland that I guess I won't name because I don't really want to come an endorsement, but
yeah,
it was exactly what I needed. There was a focus on health, there was a focus on meditation, there was a focus on actually taking care of oneself. There were, it was just this very holistic treatment place that it was just exactly what I needed. And so I think there was a desire in me, a really strong desire to get clean. And as soon as the resource became available, I just was all over it.
Sure. So it sounds to me like you as a sort of solo musician and a person who's very cerebral and very rational and logical by nature, you spent a lot of time alone and also with your thoughts. Did that experience of, speaking out and asking for help, and then, moving into this process help you to understand the value of, connection, and that we need other people, and, how did interacting with other people as a person with a, social anxiety, change for you after that?
Well, it's kind of interesting because the social anxiety thing for me actually, in a weird way, was sort of remedied remedied by substance use, which I think is why it took hold of me so much.
Sure.
I mean, they're right now looking into ecstasy as a potential, relational therapy, as, like something that they could use therapeutically. And for me, and it's different because it was almost undoubtedly cut with some sort of amphetamine or something else. But the first time I tried ecstasy, it allowed me to realize that there was a difference, that it was possible to just speak what felt right from moment to moment.
Right.
People weren't going to judge you. It got me to the place where I'm able to speak without feeling as though I need to think about everything before I say it. So, like with a lot of experiences like that, it sort of showed me the map, but then I confused the map for the territory.
Right.
And so the social anxiety thing had sort of been out of my mind for some time at that point, because, I did ecstasy when I was 15 and I didn't get clean until I was 18. And so at that point, I was still very cerebral. I was not nearly as much, but it was sort of this thing where I was just in a situation, I was in a context where it was more obvious to me that people who wanted to hang out with me wanted to hang out with me. Because when you're doing drugs, it's you hang out with people because they have drugs, or they hang out with you because you have drugs. And
Right.
maybe you have some people that you hang out with more often, but it's usually because you trust them, and or at least you trust them more than you trust other people. And
Right.
that's not saying much. But when I got clean, there was a saying that I still believe to be true, which is like, oh, when you get clean, the only thing you have to change, it's only one thing, and that one thing is everything. That's what you have to change. So, I didn't hang out with the people I used to hang out with. I changed my phone number. I started living in a different place. I got a new job. It was everything. I just completely upended my context and replaced it with a new one. And it eventually became like, okay, this person wants to hang out with me because they enjoy my company. That was mind blowing to me. The first time that was the case, it was like, whoa, really? You're inviting me to come hang out? I don't know. It sounds really sad.
It's so true, and I understand it so deeply. What do you actually like me? What do you mean?
Like, are you sure you're not confusing me for somebody else?
Right. You thought about me and I wasn't standing right in front of you?
Exactly.
So what an enormous privilege for you, not only to, have the resources to, to access rehab and to get to go somewhere that really, really spoke to you and, helped you learn a healthier path. But also to be able to move and change your phone number and, have a completely different, sort of existence. What was that like for you?
I mean, first and foremost, it actually breaks my heart that there are so many people that either are going through what I was going through or have gone through what I went through and didn't have that same resource availability. And I wonder a lot about, there's kind of this survivor's guilt thing about
Sure.
Where would I be if that set of resources wasn't available to me? Would I even still be here? There were a lot of times where I stopped breathing near the end of my drug use, where it was, I was close to death. And so, how many more of those did I have in me? And I don't know. And so I absolutely consider it a huge blessing and a privilege to have been able to access those resources, to be able to go where I went and do what I did, and be in a sober living house for a year.
Mm-hmm.
And all of those things were just, they made a huge difference to me. And the other thing, the other angle of that I need to consider, because you can imagine if you follow that train of thought too far, it'll take you to, oh, I'm just lucky, I don't deserve any of this kind of thing. But the flip side of that is that, a lot of the people that I was in treatment with either aren't sober, or, I would say at least 3 or 4 of them have died since.
Right.
Young people, you know, it's, and in theory, they had access to the same resources I did.
Yeah,
And so
exactly.
there's a nuance to it, like anything that's true. And
No, but I think that that's a really important point. You know, you have to recognize the privilege and the good fortune that you had, and you also have to give yourself credit for the work that you have indeed done and the commitment that you have made to, you know, remaining healthy.
right. And I think that honestly, cultivating that worldview has helped me in so many other ways than just recovery.
Of course.
So many things. I mean, obviously a big national conversation that's happening right now that we probably shouldn't stick our toes too far into, but you know, the concept of privilege and the concept of, you know, people say like, well, I don't have privilege because I worked every day for, you know,
Right.
years to get this house. And it's like, those two things aren't mutually exclusive. And
No.
for me, it's like, that's been painfully obvious of like, yes, I was privileged to have access to these resources, and I had to work really hard to actually make use of those resources. And to understand that nuance, I think would help a lot of people, myself included.
All of us. It's actually a conversation that we have very frequently in If You Could See Me Land. We had an event last night, and I interviewed an activist for 45 minutes on stage, and we talked all about privilege. She's a woman of color. I am a white woman. And we talked about privilege and recognizing your privilege and the different types of privilege. And you know, just because you don't have one type of privilege doesn't mean you don't have another type of privilege. And the value and the benefit of us as a human race having these conversations, understanding that it doesn't negate the work that you have done to say that you also were privileged in some aspect of what you received. And that's not just you, that's any of us.
Too true. I mean, and I think about, you know, one of the things that crosses my mind whenever I start thinking about this particular line of thought is, you know, it would have been, yeah, I think about an experience that I had where this girl and I were smoking heroin in her car up at the top of some like point, and a cop pulled up to the window, and we just pretended to be making out, and he basically was just like, oh, okay, well, you kids, you know, you rascals, get back home, you know, and that was it. You know, that was the whole conversation. And I think about, if I wasn't in Boulder, Colorado, a very rich white city, and if I wasn't, you know, if I wasn't a tall, average looking white dude, you know, like, would that situation have gone differently? You know, how could that have gone differently? And I think it's like, it's so obvious to me that the only reason I don't have a criminal record or something to that effect, or that I'm not in jail, is just that they weren't looking for me, you know?
Right.
I'm not where they were looking.
It leaves me, you know, speechless to understand the amount of, you know, of work that we still have left in front of us when we talk about these issues. And still, you know, gives me so much hope when I do hear people talk like you just spoke, and the fact that, you know, it is, we can do this. We can open our eyes to things that we have never had to before, and we still don't have to. As white people, we don't have to look at this stuff. We don't have to think about it. But if we want the world to be the way that we envision it, we have no choice.
Right. Well, and that's it's interesting because it's one of those needs, right? And I can't remember whether it was in middle school or high school, and they were talking about what are your needs. And there were these very sort of, again, we were talking about cerebral, know-it-all teenagers who were like, well, all you really need is food, water, and shelter. And it's like, anyone who's lived for more than a decade and a half knows that that's just a preposterous thing to say. You know,
Right.
like what you need is social connection, and what you need is purpose, and what you need is love and acceptance and, you know, freedom and responsibility. Like these are all things that you need, like capital N need, and are not always obvious to you. And so I think when we talk about needing to have this conversation, to me that's true on like an existential level of like,
Yeah.
we don't feel as though we need this, but we really do,
Mm-hmm.
from both the perspective of human rights. Yeah, and you know, so many of these issues that we're dealing with right now are so intensely interwoven that you can't separate something like climate change from something like you know, racism.
Right.
They're really tied together in a way that as soon as one starts to really understand those things, it's
You
I mean,
see how it's all connected.
oh, and you start to see how it's all connected, and you start to realize like, okay, I can't claim to understand every single aspect of this, and that's why you need to learn to listen.
Yep.
Is, you know, like someone who works in one, I mean, this is a bad example considering where we're at right now, but if someone who works in a department of the government shouldn't assume that they know all the nuances of another department of the government. Like ideally, people have specializations that are rooted in their either their education or their upbringing or their passion or whatever it is. And so it would be preposterous and really presumptuous of me to assume that I know another person's experience well enough to prescribe them a solution.
Right. Right. But that's a certain amount of humility that has to be earned and desired.
Mm.
You know, you have to want to be that humble. You have to want to be that self-aware to understand that just because you've been alive all of your life in your skin doesn't mean that you have any understanding of what that means for someone else. I teach personal narrative storytelling,
Mm.
and we talk a lot about, you know, when a person is beginning the process of learning to tell the story of their life, and really comes with the desire to want to tell it both to themselves and to the world in a different way than they have told it to themselves historically. And they say, but I don't know where to start. I want to start all the way at the beginning and tell everything. And, you know, for the purpose of our showcases, they don't have more than 10 minutes. So it's not possible to tell your entire life story effectively in 10 minutes. And, you know, what I always impart to them is that, you know, you have to trust your audience. You have to trust that that anybody who's going to listen to what you have to say has not lived your life. So no matter how many words you say, they're not going to fully and completely be able to understand your experience. All they can do is imprint their experience onto what you're telling them. So you don't have to give the entire world. You just have to give enough to make it resonate. And so I'm curious, for you as a musician, you write very specifically about your mental health and about, you know, not everybody knows what it's like to live with bipolar, but I would imagine that people who don't have bipolar are moved by your music. So can you talk about, you know, what you think resonates with people who, you know, haven't lived your experience, but at the same time have, you know, are moved by what you have to say and are able to imprint their experience on what you're sharing with them?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. I've had, especially with the Evoke project, which is the alias I used before I started using my name, I've
Mm-hmm.
had some, I would say, moderate success. Like there were a couple songs that did, you know, a couple million plays on Spotify and YouTube and stuff. You know, there was some stuff that was like, it went relatively, I would say, big, but the people that really stuck with me, especially from the switch from Evoke over to Alden Groves,
Mm-hmm.
the thing that they always, if they're asked or even just unprompted, people always bring up that it's the sincerity or the authenticity, or a word people throw around a lot is visceral. So I think that for whatever reason, I think it, it reminds me of being young and talking about you hurt my feelers. It's like I just feel stuff in this really raw, ragged way, and then I've kind of like just spent a lot of time removing the boundary between that and my communication. I'm doing live streams now, and a lot of the times the goal is to go from absolutely nothing to a sketch of a full song in a couple hours. And so when you're in that state of being, you don't have time. I don't give myself time to think about, what will this look like? What will this say about me? What image will this project? And that's very much, even not when I'm live streaming, that's my style in the studio too. I want there to be as little boundary between what I feel, what I'm doing, and what I'm saying as possible. And so I write very quickly, I produce very quickly, I sketch incredibly quickly. And that's one of the things I focused on, is reducing sort of the latency between my experience and my art. And so I think that what's wonderful is that that's cultivated, the fan base that I do have is all people that are really interested in this stuff, that really want to feel their feelings and like want that depth of emotion and that rawness, but they still have this sort of desire for like the intensity of electronic music too. Like, even though I don't necessarily work in a style that I would consider predominantly electronic right now, the flavor of that is still absolutely there. And I think that especially younger people right now, I think connect with that more than sort of the acoustic sound right now. And I think it's becoming increasingly obvious to everybody that one is not more expressive than the other. And so I think that what I'm really trying to do is I'm trying to push that boundary. I'm trying to make like the most expressive, authentic, sincere, and direct music that I can make without resorting to conventions that typically accompany that, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. What makes you most excited just in your life?
Oh gosh. What makes me the most excited? I think it is this music project. I think it's making music that I want to listen to.
Sure.
And I had always believed, and I still sometimes have to fight this belief, that people use the word successful as synonymous with wealthy, basically.
Mm-hmm.
You should be a successful musician, meaning you should be wealthy as a result of your music. And I feel as though I'm already a successful musician, and I have, a day job. In some senses, I have two. I work in a coffee shop a couple days a week, and I teach music production in Denver a couple days a week. But all of that, for me, is less important than when I listen to a song in my car on the way to work that I made the day previous, and I'm like, this is what I wanted to do. I went into the studio wanting to make something like this, and I did it. Like, this landed and this worked. And to me, that's success. And it's even another level when I get to share that with people. But I can't personally invest too much in sharing it with people, because especially the way that it manifests right now with, what the numbers just look like on social media, like I can get 55 plays on something, which, by any objective standard is really good. Like, for 55 people to have sat in on my 3-hour live stream at all is incredible. And I'm blessed to have that happen. But then depending on who you're choosing to compare yourself to, it's like, that's nothing. There's streamers that have 55,000, people watching it at one time. And so it's like it's just a matter of to whom I'm comparing myself. So for me, the way around that has been comparing myself against myself. as far as, okay, am I making music that's more effective? You know, right now my big, the bar that I've set for myself was Fool Savior, the album that I released in January. And I remember when I finished that album, I was like, what am I ever going to do after this? Because I had spent so much time on it, and I had, you know, put all this work into it. And now the stuff I'm working on right now, there are several clear ways where I can mark like, okay, yes, this is an improvement. This is an improvement for me. This is an improvement in all these different categories. And so that's exciting to me. That's what
Right.
keeps me going. And that's honestly why I can't stop doing music. It's why it's not an option for me to stop. Because I had the thought of trying to do the college thing. I even tried to quit music for a better part of a year. I didn't make almost anything. And I was, you know, trying to figure out how to do the college thing. And I just became this very sad, miserable person.
Right.
And I couldn't figure out why until I sat down in my car one day after getting out of a boxing class. And I thought about what I had spent my money on. And I was like, well, I spent money on this weird exercise supplement, and I spent money on this, and I spent money on that. And I was like, what am I doing? I could have spent that money on samples. I could have spent that money on a guitar. I could have spent that money on plugins for my software. It was just suddenly so embarrassingly obvious that this was such a waste of my time and money to be doing anything else. And
Yes.
like a week later, I wrote Vertigo, you know, like, which was like the big single off of that album. And it's like, you know, it was just, like I said, it was so obvious, it was almost embarrassing.
You know, it's really, I love what you said about not comparing yourself, because in this, you know, and just sort of following your own voice and comparing yourself to yourself only, which is incredibly difficult to do. But I think it's really important for the audience to hear someone who they're listening to on a podcast talking about this album and that release and this number of, you know, of listens, and, you know, and really living in this world that people tend to kind of put up on a pedestal and say, oh, well, they've done something that you know, they're way beyond me. They're, you know, they're further down the road. And, you know, in many cases, you know, you are further down the road, but at the same time, the idea that, you know, you still have to actively consider how you think about yourself and your music and your career and your level of success. And it is a constant, it's a job. It's, you know, and it requires effort to be able to really consider how the fact that you don't reach a certain level of success and then stop having to think about those things.
Right. Well, and it's also like, I hate resenting someone else's success.
Sure.
To me, like, anytime I catch myself feeling that way, I'm like, oh man, I missed the boat somewhere a while back. I needed to like center up and remind myself that that's like, it's irrelevant to my life too. And that's the other thing that is really worth considering for me a lot, is like, okay, I want to, quote, be doing music full time, unquote. But in very literal terms, what would that actually mean for my life? You know, what would I be spending my time doing? How would that be noticeably different? And there's some stuff that I think would be a market improvement. Like, I'd love to be touring. That would be something that would be high on my list of things that I think would be enjoyable. Like, I love being on stage. I love performing. I love that whole aspect of music. And it's harder when you're working, you know, jobs. But on another level, it's also like, well, I would have certain things that I wouldn't want to do, and I would do those for X amount of time. And then I would have time to make music that I cared about, and I would do that for X amount of time. And it's like, well, that's in many respects functionally identical to what I'm doing right now.
Right.
You know, and so I think that a lot of people idealize, you know, I've had a lot of people who say like, I'm going to take the plunge and do full-time music. And when I tried to do that, it was actually a huge mistake. I mean, I hesitate to say that because obviously you can look at anything and be like, that shaped who I am today. But,
Mhm.
I spent a year trying to do music full time and just flopped and ended up with thousands of dollars in credit card debt. And it wasn't any better. I was depressed because I wasn't leaving my house because I was trying to work on music and I didn't connect with anybody. And then I went back to working this, food service job, which people have this idea that, I work as a barista, and people have this idea that that's just the bottom of the barrel. But I love my job, and I
Right.
love the people that I work with. And I get to, come to work in the morning and help to make people's day better. And I do that with like hundreds of people that come through during the course of my shift. And I think that because that's what I spend my kind of work time doing, I can come back and sit in the studio and be like, this is fresh and new and exciting.
Right.
And it sounds really wonderful for me to open up my software and start messing around. It's exciting to film a video.
It's really interesting, because once you make that concerted effort to remove other people's voices and other people's expectations from the choices that you make, the shoulds, if you will, you're supposed to do things this way in order to be this person that you envision yourself to be, and you just do what feels most authentic to you, you end up, finding yourself much happier. You find yourself in a place where, you are living the life that makes sense for you. And, I think it's really interesting that you have, as we move into the sort of final part of our conversation, I really admire you for taking a shift from going to being, a person who's identified as one type of musician, one type of person in the world, and saying, well, I want to evolve. I want to go over here. And that takes a certain amount of courage and hope and belief that, okay, I can do this. But at the same time, in many ways, it also requires starting from scratch. And I think that would stop a lot of people, from moving in a different direction.
Yeah, I think
yeah.
that what a lot of people don't realize, and what I wish I could communicate to people more, is that when you are presented with a situation that feels impossible, it only feels impossible. I've told a lot of people about certain aspects of my story, whether it's drug addiction or, I could go, there's a whole list, but it's long and short of it is that's neither the peak nor the valley, the drug addiction stuff. And people are like, oh man, I don't know what I would do. And the answer is that you just keep going,
That's right.
And that's really, it's both as simple and as complicated as that. And I'm not, the only thing I would sort of say is a character virtue that would maybe get me through all this stuff is that I'm sort of relentlessly optimistic, and
Mm-hmm.
I want to do well, and I want other people to feel good. If I had to distill why I'm doing better than maybe a lot of those other people that were in the same treatment program or that have had the same sort of diagnosis or traumas as me, it would be like those three things. It's like, I just know that there's another side if you keep going, and I want to get there, and I want to help other people get there. And so if you just cultivate that in yourself, I think that many of the things that seem insurmountable really quickly become just tests of patience.
Mm-hmm. So tell people where they can find you.
Yes, I love when people can find me. So my name is, as you may see probably in the heading of the podcast, it's Alden Groves, ALDENGROVES. I would say the place I'm going to be most active is going to be on YouTube. So that would just be youtube.com/Alden Groves. You can also find me on Twitter at the same URL. The Facebook one is different. I can't recall what it is. But
It's okay. I'm going to put it all up so they'll be able to find you.
great. But yeah, I would say YouTube would be the place I would steer people the most, because I'm doing vlogs. I release all my music there. I am doing reviews of other people's music. I have a lot planned there that I'm really excited for. And it's also, especially with the live streams, it's one of the most direct ways that I can engage with people. And and make it a part of the music too.
Is there anything that you want the world to know about you that I didn't ask you today?
Oh, geez. You know, I honestly, I feel like what I said earlier was such a nice little closer that I would hesitate. I think I'm going to put a bow on it back there. Just cultivate compassion and optimism and work ethic. And that's, you will get the best that you can get with those 3 qualities.
I totally agree with you. Alden, it has been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much. I wish you all the best.
I so appreciate you having me on.
I hope you go on tour so that you can come to the East Coast and, I can meet you.
I would love that. We'll make it happen. I'm just putting that out into the world. We can make it so.
All right, let's do it.
Thanks, Erin.
Great. Thank you.
We can have these difficult conversations in the light of day. We can laugh, joke, and get serious about making change. I hope you will take some time to check out all of our resources and consider sharing your story on our website, ifyoucouldseeme.com. I hope you'll consider helping out by visiting our Patreon page, patreon.com/ifyoucouldseeme, purchasing my book, rating and reviewing this podcast on iTunes to help people find us, or just send me a message to let me know how this project is impacting you, ways we can improve, and future podcast or blog topics. This was only an idea until amazing people like you joined me in bringing it to life.